The dusty western town of Willow Creek shimmered under the unforgiving sun. Wagons rattled past the wooden storefronts, their wheels crunching against gravel, while townsfolk gathered in little clusters, trading goods, trading stories, and more often than not, trading gossip. It was a place where nothing stayed secret for long, and whispers traveled faster than the wind itself. At the far end of the main street, a young woman walked with measured, hesitant steps. Her name was Emily Carter, though few bothered to call her by it. She carried a small, weathered satchel pressed tightly to her chest, as if it were only protection against the stairs drilling into her back. Her plain dress, once white, had faded to the color of desert sand, and the bonnet shielding her face did little to hide the scars that curved across her cheek. Children paused in their play to point at her, mothers tugged them away, and men lowered their voices to mutter behind her. Emily had grown used to it, but familiarity did not dull the sting. Every whisper she caught in the wind was a reminder of the life she had come from, a house filled not with warmth, but with sharp words and colder silences. Her father had called her useless, her mother had turned her face away, and her fiancé, once the promise of a brighter future, had shattered her heart with a single sentence: "No man wants a broken woman." He had walked away the night before their wedding, leaving her with a tattered gown and humiliation that burned deeper than her scars ever could. Now she was here, in a town where no one knew her story in detail, but everyone seemed to know enough. The scar across her cheek was all they needed to form their own conclusions. She was the girl left behind, the woman no one wanted. Emily tried to keep her head high, but her shoulders betrayed her, curving inward as though to shield herself from the weight of judgment. She made her way past a mercantile, where two women stood whispering in tones loud enough to be overheard. "Poor thing. Abandoned, wasn't she?" one said, fanning herself. "Or cursed," the other replied, eyes narrowing. "Best keep your boys away from her." The words cut deeper than a knife. Emily felt her throat tighten, the familiar ache of tears threatening to spill. But she had promised herself no more crying in public. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Her feet carried her toward the edge of town, where the noise dulled into silence. She found an old wooden bench outside the abandoned telegraph office and sat down, her small satchel beside her. Dust swirled in the air, coating her dress, clinging to her skin. The weight of the day pressed against her chest until breathing itself felt like a battle. She clasped her hands tightly in her lap, staring down at the raw red lines that marked her palms, scars from years of hard work, from carrying burdens no young woman should have borne alone. Her parents had never seen her as a daughter, only as an extra pair of hands. And when she was betrothed, they had treated it not as a blessing, but as a transaction. A daughter traded for stability. A burden finally lifted. But when even that failed, when the groom rejected her, they had washed their hands of her completely. "Go," her father had said coldly, his voice echoing in her memory. "You bring nothing but shame." Emily shivered at the remembered cruelty, though the day was unbearably hot. The sting of betrayal still clung to her like the desert dust. She had begged, just once, for someone to see her worth, to tell her she mattered. Instead, she had been cast aside like unwanted baggage. Around her, the town carried on as if she did not exist. Wagons rolled by, merchants shouted their wares, children laughed in the distance. And yet, in the midst of it all, she had never felt more invisible. Her gaze lifted to the horizon. The desert stretched endlessly before her, wide and merciless. It looked the way her heart felt, empty, vast, and hopeless. For a long time, she sat there, listening to the faint sound of wagon wheels fading into nothingness. That sound mirrored her life, the echo of people leaving, of promises breaking, of love that never stayed. By the time the sun dipped lower in the sky, streaking the clouds with shades of fire, Emily's tears finally spilled over. She wept quietly, her face hidden by the brim of her bonnet, her shoulders trembling. Not for the first time, she wondered if she had been left in this world to suffer and nothing more. But deep inside, buried beneath the layers of pain and humiliation, a tiny flicker still fought to live. A whisper her heart refused to silence. Maybe someone will see me differently. Maybe I wasn't meant to be unwanted forever. And though Emily did not yet know it, destiny was already at work, guiding her steps toward the one man who would prove that her scars did not define her, and that silence itself could speak the loudest kind of love. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the streets of Willow Creek, turning dust into gold haze. Merchants packed away their goods, children scattered, and the town's rhythm slowed under the weight of the heat. Emily still sat on the old bench, her hands folded tightly, trying to ignore the whispers that seemed to follow her everywhere. She thought herself invisible, until the moment a shadow fell across her, one that didn't belong to any gossiping townsfolk. He was a tall figure, broad-shouldered, his hat pulled low against the sun. His boots struck the dirt with a steady rhythm, and though the street was crowded, people instinctively stepped aside to let him pass. His name was Ethan Cole, though most knew him only as a rancher who spoke little and carried much sorrow. His wife had died years ago, some said in childbirth. Others whispered of a child lost soon after. Whatever the truth, the grief carved deep lines into his face, and the silence in his eyes was louder than any words. Ethan hadn't meant to stop. He had come to town for supplies, his list tucked into the worn pocket of his coat. But his gaze caught the sight of a young woman stumbling from the mercantile, her arms hugging a bundle of fabric too heavy for her slender frame. Emily, still weary from her long day, tripped on the uneven step. Gasps rippled to the crowd as the bundle spilled across the dirt road, scraps of cloth and bread scattering like shame for all to see. The townsfolk laughed. A boy snickered, pointing to the scar on her cheek. A woman whispered loudly, "That's the girl her fiancé left." Another man muttered, "Should have been left where she came from." The cruelty was sharp, deliberate, and Emily froze, her hands trembling as she tried to gather her things. Her eyes burned with humiliation. And then, without a word, Ethan stepped forward. He bent down, his gloved hands brushing the dirt from the bundle, gathering it with the ease of a man who had carried burdens heavier than most men could imagine. He handed the items back to her one by one, his rough hands steady against her shaking ones. His eyes, shadowed beneath his hat, lifted just enough to meet hers. They were not filled with pity, not disgust, only a quiet, steady strength. Emily swallowed hard, her throat too tight for words. Nobody had stood between her and the cruelty of others before. Nobody had cared enough. Yet here was a stranger, silent but firm, shielding her in the simplest of ways. When one of the men scoffed and muttered, "She ain't worth the trouble," Ethan's jaw tightened. He shifted his stance, placing himself between Emily and the crowd. His voice, low and gravelly from disuse, finally broke the silence. "You don't deserve this." The words were few, but they struck harder than any long speech could have. They were firm, unshakable, and for the first time in years, Emily felt the sting of tears not from shame, but from being defended. The crowd grew uncomfortable under Ethan's steady stare. One by one, the whispers faded, the laughter died, and people turned away. Silence reclaimed the street, broken only by the soft sound of fabric rustling as Ethan handed the last of Emily's belongings back to her. Emily clutched the bundle to her chest, her lips parting as if to thank him, but no words came. Her voice trembled and failed. Instead, she nodded once, her eyes meeting his in silent gratitude. For a fleeting moment, something unspoken passed between them, her brokenness and his quiet strength, both etched in silence. Ethan tipped his hat, a small gesture of respect, before turning to continue down the road. He didn't linger, didn't demand, didn't ask, but his presence left something behind in Emily's heart, something she hadn't felt in a long time, the faintest spark of worth. As she watched him disappear into fading sunlight, Emily realized she didn't even know his name, yet the echo of his words lingered with her, wrapping around her wounded heart like a shield. "You don't deserve this." For the first time since she had been abandoned, Emily allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the world still held someone willing to stand beside her. The evening wind swept across Willow Creek, carrying the smell of dust and old wood. By the time Emily left the mercantile, the whispers had already spread like wildfire. She held her small bundle close, heart sinking as she realized she had nowhere to go. The rented room at the inn had been taken from her that morning when she failed to pay. The only roof she had was gone, and the streets of town, lined with gossip and judgment, offered no safety. She sat on the edge of the wooden boardwalk, staring at her frayed shoes, trying to hold back the rising panic. The memory of cruel laughter still rang in her ears. The world seemed so unbearably heavy, and for a moment she wondered if she was truly cursed to wander without a home. Then she noticed the same shadow again, the tall figure from before. Ethan Cole stood a short distance away, holding a small sack of supplies in one hand. His eyes, dark beneath the brim of his hat, studied her silently. He didn't speak immediately. Silence was his armor. But after a long pause, his voice, low and steady, broke through the twilight. "You'll be safe at my ranch." The words were simple. No promises of comfort, no grand speeches of rescue. Just quiet certainty. Yet to Emily, they landed like thunder. Safe. She had almost forgotten what that word meant. She blinked, unsure she had heard him correctly. I couldn't," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't even know you." Ethan shifted slightly, the leather of his gloves creaking as he adjusted the sack in his hand. "Don't need to know me," he said plainly. "Only need to know you don't belong out here alone." His gaze flickered toward the emptying street, where shadows lengthened and doors closed one by one. The unspoken truth hung heavy in the air. A woman alone at night in this town would not last long. Emily's chest tightened. Every instinct told her not to trust easily, not after betrayals, the abandonment, the scorn. Yet something in Ethan's tone was different. There was no pity in it, no hidden motive she could sense, only a quiet firmness, as though offering shelter was as natural to him as breathing. Hesitant but desperate, she finally nodded. Ethan gave a short incline of his head, as if acknowledging a contract silently agreed upon. Without another word, he walked toward the edge of town, where his wagon waited, the old wood frame creaking in the cooling air. The wagon ride began in silence. Emily sat with her bundle clutched to her chest, the rough boards beneath her rattling with every turn of the wheels. Ethan held the reins loosely, his focus on the long stretch of desert road ahead. The clip-clop of the horse's hooves filled the space between them, steady and rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. Emily dared a glance at him once or twice. His face was strong, weathered by sun and sorrow, his jaw set as if he carried the weight of the whole land on his shoulders. He didn't look at her, didn't press her with questions. The silence between them was not cruel. It was protective, like a blanket that asked nothing in return. As the town lights faded into the distance, Emily's thoughts swirled. Why would a stranger care? She asked herself again and again. Men in her past had cared only when it suited them. Her family had cared only until her scars made her a burden. Her fiancé had cared only until his pride was threatened. But this man, this silent cowboy, offered her safety with nothing asked in return. The thought both comforted and unsettled her. The desert stretched wide around them, painted in hues of orange and purple by the setting sun. The road seemed endless, a reminder of the lonely path she had walked all her life. Yet now, she was not walking it alone. The silence of the wagon ride became symbolic, a journey away from humiliation, towards something unknown. At last, when the horizon darkened into night, Ethan spoke again. His words were short, but they carried weight. "It's not much, just land, cattle, and a roof. But it's quiet. You'll be safe there." Emily held her bundle tighter, her throat aching with unshed tears. She wanted to ask him why. Why help her? Why bother with someone broken, someone cast aside? But the words wouldn't come. For now, she only let the quiet settle in her heart. For the first time in years, she felt a faint possibility of belonging, uncertain, fragile, but real. And as the wagon rolled on beneath the stars, Emily thought that maybe safety wasn't about walls or doors. Maybe it was about the presence of someone who would stand firm when the world turned cruel. The wagon jolted to a stop, and Emily blinked as the shape of Ethan's ranch came into view. It wasn't grand or fancy like the estates she once imagined in girlish dreams. It was simple wooden fences, a modest barn, a weather house standing steady against the endless sweep of desert. Yet in its quiet strength, it felt like more than she had ever been offered. A place that stood firm, like the man who had brought her here. Ethan climbed down first, steadying the reins before turning to offer his hand. Emily hesitated, clutching her bundle tightly. The moonlight caught the scar along his jaw, sharp and unyielding, and for a moment she wondered if she made a terrible mistake trusting him. But when his hand stayed outstretched, patient and without demand, she took it. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. The walls were plain, the furniture worn, but cared for. Ethan walked ahead, striking a match to light a lantern. Its glow chased away the shadows, revealing shelves lined with old books, a sturdy table, and floors swept clean. Everything felt orderly, purposeful. Without saying much, Ethan led her down a narrow hall and opened a door. The room beyond was small but spotless. A bed neatly made with fresh linens, a folded quilt at its foot, and a small wash basin waiting by the window. Emily froze at the sight, her throat tightening. No man had ever prepared a place for her, not without expecting something in return. "You can rest here," Ethan said simply, setting the lantern on the dresser. His voice was steady, without the edge of pity or the weight of expectation. "You owe me nothing." The word struck her harder than any insult she had endured. You owe me nothing. Her family had made her feel like a burden. Her fiancé had made her feel like a prize to be bargained. And here was a stranger, the silent cowboy, offer her the one thing she never thought she'd have, a space of her own, freely given. Her eyes burned as she touched the quilt, running her fingers over the hand-stitched patterns. It wasn't lavish, but it was real, solid, a kindness she couldn't comprehend. "Why?" she whispered before she could stop herself. "Why would you do this?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He simply adjusted his hat, his gaze steady but unreadable. "Because everyone deserves a safe place," he finally said, as if the answer needed no further explanation. And with that, he gave her a short nod and stepped back into the hall. When the door clicked shut, Emily sank onto the edge of the bed. The mattress dipped softly under her weight, and she pressed her face into her hands. For so long, she had been cast aside, treated as if her existence had no value. Yet here, in a small, quiet room, she was being treated as though she mattered. The silence of the ranch pressed in around her, but it was different from the silence of the town's rejection. This silence was warm, protective. For the first time in years, she wasn't listening for the sound of mocking voices or harsh footsteps coming to demand more from her. She lay back slowly, clutching her bundle against her chest, staring at the wooden ceiling beams. Her heart still trembled with doubt, whispering that kindness always carried a hidden price. But another thought, fragile and almost too daring, crept in as her eyes grew heavy. Maybe not this time. Maybe this man is different. As sleep tugged her into its arms, Emily breathed in the faint scent of cedar and earth. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving the night. She was resting in it. And somewhere down the hall, the silent cowboy sat alone by the fire, his rough hands folded, his eyes lingering on the closed door. He hadn't given her much, just a room of her own. But to him, and perhaps to her, it was the beginning of something that mattered. The room Ethan had given her was quiet, almost too quiet. Emily sat by the small wash basin in the corner, a cracked mirror leaning against the wall. The lantern's soft glow flickered, and in its trembling light, her own reflection stared back at her. She froze. Her fingers brushed against her cheek, tracing the faint line of a scar, one that never quite faded. It wasn't deep, but to her, it was the mark that everyone seemed to see before anything else. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Ugly girl. You'll bring us nothing but shame." Her throat tightened. She remembered the whispers of relatives, the way men turned away, and the cruel laughter of her former fiancé when he chose another. "Who would want someone like you?" The words replayed like a curse, sharper than any blade. Emily squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the memories, but they crowded her anyway. Faces twisted in disdain, hands pushing her away. Her father's silence that stung worse than scorn. She pressed her palms to her ears, wishing the ghost would finally leave her alone. When she opened her eyes again, the girl in the mirror looked broken, her shoulders slumped, her eyes rimmed with red. She hated that reflection. She hated that she still carried every cruel word carved into her bones. A bitter whisper slipped from her lips. "Unwanted, cursed, A soft knock at the door startled her. The latch didn't turn. No one barged in. Instead, a low voice called gently through the wood. "I left some supper by the door." She hesitated, staring at the door as if it might demand payment for the kindness. Slowly, she rose and opened it just a crack. A tray rested on the floor, bread, stew, and a mug of warm tea. Ethan was nowhere in sight. Her chest tightened again, but this time differently. No pressure, no eyes watching her, no demands, just quiet care. She bent down, picking up the tray with trembling hands. Why would he, she whispered, unable to finish the thought. That night, she ate slowly, her body still tense, as if expecting someone to knock and ask for repayment. But no one did. The food was plain yet filling, the tea soothing against her throat. By the time she set the tray aside, the ache in her chest had softened just enough to let her breathe. The next morning, she found a folded blanket left by the door. She ran her fingers over the stitching, warm from someone else's hands. Again, no words, no demands, just a quiet offering. When she saw Ethan later in the barn, repairing a broken stall, she wanted to say something, anything, but the word stuck. He didn't press. He just tipped his hat, the faintest acknowledgement, before returning to his work. That small respect, leaving her space, letting her choose when to speak, felt heavier than all the empty promises she had once been given. That evening, Emily sat on the bed, clutching the quilt around her shoulders. For the first time, she whispered not the words of her family, but something else. Maybe I'm not cursed. Maybe I'm still here for a reason. And though Ethan didn't hear it, though he stayed in the quiet of his own grief by the fire, a bond had begun to take root, subtle, fragile, but real. The sun rose over the wide plains, painting the horizon gold. Emily woke to the smell of hay and the distant sound of hooves striking against the wooden corral. For a moment, she just sat by the window of her small room, watching the quiet ranch stretch endlessly before her. It felt different from the cramped, suffocating homes of her past. Here, there was space to breathe. Outside, Ethan moved with steady purpose. He carried buckets of water, checked the horses, and mended a sagging section of fence. He didn't rush, didn't curse, didn't bark orders at anyone. Every movement was deliberate, almost as though the silence was his language. Emily lingered by the doorway, unsure if she should intrude. But when one of the younger colts kicked over a water bucket, she found herself stepping forward. Without thinking, she stooped to set it right, splashing water across her dress. Ethan looked up. For a heartbeat, she feared rebuke. Instead, he gave her the smallest nod and said softly, "Thank you." The words were so simple, yet they struck deep. Her family had never thanked her. Not for chores, not for service, not for anything. To them, she had been invisible, a burden. But here, a cowboy who owed her nothing had spoken with respect, as though her small action mattered. Later that day, as Ethan repaired a section of fence, Emily hesitated, then picked up a loose hammer. He glanced at her, but didn't stop her. She held the nail, hands trembling, and tapped it into place. It wasn't much, but when she looked up, his eyes softened. Again, that quiet word, "Good work." The ranch slowly began to draw her in. She learned how to scatter feed for the chickens, how to brush the horses without spooking them, and how to carry bales of hay despite her slender frame. Each time she tried, Ethan neither mocked nor dismissed her efforts. Instead, he stood nearby, ready to step in if needed, but never taking over unless she asked. One evening, as the sky turned orange, Emily dared to ask a question that had burned inside her since she arrived. "Why are you doing this? Why help me at all?" Ethan set aside the rope he had been coiling, his gaze drifting toward the fading light. For a long time, she thought he might not answer. Then, in his steady, gravel-rough voice, he spoke. "I protect. I don't hurt. That's the code I live by." The words were firm, yet gentle, not a vow made to impress, not a hollow promise meant to bind her, just truth. And in that truth, Emily felt something break inside her, a wall of fear that had been built from years of cruelty. That night, as she lay beneath the quilt he had given her, Emily turned those words over in her mind. I protect. I don't hurt. They sounded foreign, but also like the very thing she had longed to believe all her life. And slowly, with each sunrise, each shared task, each quiet thank you, the foundation of trust began to form. Not in loud declarations, but in the small, steady rhythm of a cowboy's silent code. The morning sun spilled warmth over the ranch, softening the chill of dawn. Emily had begun to settle into the rhythm of ranch life, feeding chickens, brushing horses, helping wherever she could. Yet today, something felt different. There was no heavy silence pressing against her chest, only the quiet hum of possibility. In the kitchen, she decided to cook for Ethan as a gesture of gratitude. She had never really been allowed to try before. Her family used a sneer at her clumsy hands, mocking every mistake. Nervous but determined, she rolled up her sleeves and worked. The bread dough, however, refused to cooperate. It stuck to her fingers, clung to the table, and somehow managed to splatter across her dress. When she tried to lift the pan of stew, the lid rattled loose, spilling broth across the floor. Emily gasped, cheeks burning with embarrassment, until she heard a sound behind her. Ethan stood in the doorway, silent as always, but his eyes weren't cold. There was the faintest curve at the corner of his lips, almost a smile. She stared, then suddenly burst into laughter, real, unguarded laughter that filled the kitchen and echoed through the walls. For the first time in years, the sound didn't feel foreign. It felt like freedom. Later that afternoon, while tending the horses, one of the younger colts nudged Emily playfully, knocking her sideways into a haystack. She squealed, trying to brush straw from her hair, and the colt whinnied as if mocking her. This time, Ethan actually chuckled, a low, rare sound that made her pause. Their eyes met, and in that quiet exchange, no word were needed, just warmth. As the day wore on, little sparks of hope flickered in Emily's heart. Maybe she wasn't doomed to live as unwanted. Maybe she wasn't cursed or useless. For the first time since being abandoned, she felt something she thought she'd lost forever: joy. And though Ethan said nothing, he watched her carefully. Every time her smile lit up her face, something inside his hardened heart began to thaw. He had lost so much, closed himself off from the world, but seeing her laugh again reminded him that silence could still hold beauty, and broken things could still heal. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Emily's laughter still lingered in the air. Ethan didn't speak, but when he quietly set a fresh cup of tea beside her, she looked at him with gratitude shining in her eyes. For her, the laughter had been a spark of hope. For him, it was a reminder that even in silence, love could begin to grow. The quiet peace of the ranch couldn't last forever. When Ethan and Emily went into town for supplies, whispers followed them like dust on the wind. People leaned against storefronts, muttering cruel words. "That's the girl her family abandoned," one voice sneered. "Cursed blood, no wonder they left her." Another chuckled. "Poor Cowboy doesn't even know what he's taken in." Emily's hands trembled as she clutched her small basket tighter. The words cut deeper than any blade, pulling her back to nights of ridicule, to her father's cold eyes and her mother's cruel silence. She lowered her head, wishing she could vanish into the earth. Ethan walked beside her, silent as always, but his presence was steady, a wall between her and the gossip. But gossip wasn't the only shadow lurking. By the time they returned to the ranch, trouble came knocking. A wagon rattled up the path, dust swirling around the figures who climbed down. Emily froze as she recognized them. Her relatives, the same faces that had once turned their backs on her, eyes sharp with greed and contempt. Well, one of them drawled, stepping forward. "You thought you could just disappear? She belongs to us. Blood ties don't break so easy." His gaze was filled with disdain, but also something uglier: ownership. Another voice spat. "We'll take her back. She owes us. She'll work for her keep, like she should have all along." Emily's chest tightened, fear rising like a flood. She staggered back a step, already bracing for surrender. This was a pattern of her life: insults, demands, chains. No one had ever defended her. Not once. She whispered, barely audible, "Maybe I should just go." But before she could move, Ethan stepped in front of her. His broad frame blocked the path, his jaw set like stone. His voice, when it came, was low but unyielding, the sound of a man who meant every word. "She's not leaving. Not while I breathe." The silence that followed was heavy, dangerous. Emily's relatives exchanged glances, but there was something in Ethan's eyes, quiet steel, that made them hesitate. They muttered curses, warning him he'd regret this, before finally turning their wagon around and disappearing down the trail. When the dust settled, Emily stood frozen. Her heart pounded. Her breath came in shallow bursts. She had braced herself to be abandoned again, but instead, someone had fought for her. For the first time in her life, a man had chosen to protect rather than hurt. Tears filled her eyes, and she stared at Ethan's back as if seeing him for the first time. He didn't look at her, didn't ask for gratitude. He simply said, steady and calm, "You're safe here." And in that moment, something inside Emily shifted. The shadows of her past hadn't vanished. But for the first time, she wasn't facing them alone. The evening after the confrontation was heavy with silence. The ranch, once her safe haven, suddenly felt too fragile, as if the shadows from town still lingered at its borders. Emily sat on the porch, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her eyes unfocused on the fading horizon. The words of her relatives echoed in her mind, cursed, unwanted, worthless. Ethan moved quietly in the background, his boots brushing against the wooden planks as he set down a lantern. He didn't force her to speak, he never did, but his steady presence was like an anchor in the storm. Finally, unable to hold back any longer, Emily's voice cracked. "Why would you fight for someone like me?" The question broke something inside her. Tears welled up, spilling down her cheeks as she shook her head. "All my life, I've been nothing but a burden. People have laughed at me, called me ugly, cursed. Even my own blood didn't want me. Why would you put yourself in danger for me?" For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. He leaned against the porch railing, the lantern glow catching the hard lines of his face. Then in a voice low but certain, he spoke. "Because actions don't lie. And everything I've seen tells me you matter." Emily's breath hitched. No one had ever said that to her. Not with truth in their voice, not with conviction. Her heart twisted, fragile and raw, as if those words had cracked open walls she'd built for years. Ethan pushed himself upright and stepped inside the cabin. When he returned, something small rested in his rough hand. A simple leather locket, worn but polished with care. He held it out to her, without ceremony. "This was my mother's," he said quietly. "She believed in carrying reminders of strength. Now it's yours." Emily's trembling fingers reached out, brushing against the locket. She looked up at him in disbelief. "I can't take this. It means too much." His gaze held hers, steady as a mountain's. "It means you'll never walk in fear again. Not while I'm here." The word struck deeper than any promise, deeper than any vow. Her chest tightened, but not from pain. This was something new, something terrifying and wonderful all at once. Slowly, carefully, she let him place the locket around her neck. The cool metal pressed against her skin, a symbol of protection, of belonging. Without realizing it, she leaned forward, her body trembling with both exhaustion and need. Ethan didn't hesitate. He opened his arms, strong and certain, and she stepped into them. For the first time in her life, Emily let herself collapse into another's embrace, not with fear, but with trust. Against his chest, she whispered, almost too soft to hear, "I've never felt safe like this." Ethan rested his chin gently against her hair, his silence speaking louder than words. In his arms, the weight of her past finally began to loosen, piece by piece. And in that moment, Emily understood. This cowboy had given her more than shelter. He had given each the days that followed carried with them a quiet transformation. The ranch, once shadowed by silence and loneliness, began to breathe with new life. Wildflowers sprang along the fence line, carried by the spring breeze. The horses seemed livelier, their hooves drumming joy into the earth. Even the cabin itself felt warmer, as though the walls had absorbed the laughter that had slowly begun to slip into their days. Emily felt it most of all. For years, she had lived with a heavy weight pressing against her chest, Memories of insults, scars of rejection, the endless echo of voices calling her cursed, unwanted, unloved. But now, as she worked alongside Ethan, feeding the animals, mending fences, or simply preparing meals, she realized those voices had grown distant, faint, powerless. Her hands, once shaky and uncertain, now moved with confidence. When she brushed the horses, they nuzzled against her as if they, too, sensed her new strength. When she cooked, Ethan sat at the table with quiet gratitude, offering a soft thank you that still made her heart stir. She was no longer invisible, no longer unwanted. She was seen. One afternoon, she found herself standing in front of the old cracked mirror in the spare room. For years, she had avoided reflections, afraid of the face that looked back, the scars, the imperfections, the reminders of everything she had been called. But this time, when she gazed at her reflection, she didn't see a broken girl. She saw a woman, stronger, braver, cherished. The locket Ethan had given her rested against her collarbone, a reminder that she no longer walked alone. Ethan noticed the changes, though he said little. It was in the way his eyes softened when he watched her laugh at the chickens chasing one another, or how his lips curved, just slightly, when she scolded the horses for stealing hay. He didn't need to speak to show his heart. His actions told her everything. Every board he nailed into the fence, every meal he shared, every protective glance when they rode into town. It was all his vow, wordless yet eternal. One morning, the dawn broke with colors that painted the sky in shades of fire and gold. Emily woke to the sound of the rooster crowing and the faint creak of boots on the porch. Pulling her shawl over her shoulders, she stepped outside. Ethan was already there, sitting in his usual spot, watching the horizon. His hat rested in his lap, and his scarred hands were folded loosely. He didn't turn when she joined him, but there was no need. He shifted slightly, leaving space for her beside him. She sat down, the wood cool beneath her, and together they watched the sun rise. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was gentle, like a language only they understood. Words weren't necessary. In his presence, she felt whole. Emily took a deep breath, her voice soft but steady. I used to believe I was cursed to be alone, that no one could ever truly want me. Ethan's gaze remained fixed on the horizon, but his hand reached out, covering hers with quiet certainty. His grip was firm, grounding, as if to say you'll never be alone again. Tears pricked her eyes, but they weren't from pain this time. They were from gratitude, from the overwhelming realization that she had been wrong about herself all along. She wasn't abandoned. She wasn't unwanted. She was chosen, not because someone was forced to, but because he wanted her, scars and all. The ranch around them was proof of it. Where there had once been emptiness, there was now life. Where there had been silence, there was laughter. And in her heart, where there had once been fear, there was love. Emily leaned her head against Ethan's shoulder. He said nothing, only let the weight of her rest against him. His silence was not empty. It was full, stronger than any word she had ever longed to hear. The sun climbed higher, painting the sky brighter, and Emily closed her eyes, letting herself finally believe in the peace she had found. Her past was full of pain, but in his silence, she found a love that spoke louder than words. A vow, silent, steady, and unbreakable.